Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 20 of the Peoples of Middle-earth. And tonight, it is my reckless ambition to finish the first chapter of the late writings. We're no way going to get to the Shibboleth of Feanor tonight, but I think maybe we might wind our way towards the end. Now, that's a pretty tall order, as there's still a lot to talk about. But we'll see. We'll see how we actually do. First, though, I just want to make a couple announcements. Just want to draw some things to your attention. If you go to blackberry.signumuniversity.org, so much of what we do at Signum lives here. You can find our events here. You can find space here. You can sign up for tutorials here. So much goes on here at Blackberry. So you can see here on my events menu here on the left-hand side, this is Mythmoot, where you can sign up for Mythmoot. Really exciting. It is such an exciting time of year to see the registration list for Mythmoot growing and be able to look at it and check out the names that are there and people I'm looking forward to seeing again this year. Mythmoot is always so much fun. And by the way, I decided last night in exploring the Lord of the Rings that at Mythmoot this year, I want to do a forensic reenactment of the conflict between Gandalf and the Balrog on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. Totally going to happen. Not quite sure when. And I don't think any massive insurance waivers are going to be required. But anyway, there we are. So that's Mythmoot. And then, of course, we continue through the rest of our spring moots and all the way to the towards the fall. We only have one. We've got Sunshine Moot, of course, happening next. That's March 7th, coming up in just a couple weeks in Orlando, Florida. Looking forward to seeing the Sunshine Moot folks again. And then we've got Tex Moot in April, and several others happening later on, including 2 in Europe coming up this year, both Willamoot in Leuven, Belgium on May 23rd, and then Euromoot in Prague from October 2nd to 4th. So anyway, but Euromoot is the only fall, well, Helcaraxamoot if you start, if by fall I mean everything after Mythmoot, right, then Helcaraxamoot technically counts, as it's the first of the post-Mythmoot, the second half of the year moots, basically. So that's in August 1st, of course, in Fairbanks, Alaska. Really excited about that. There's a whole bunch of moots forthcoming. We've got, I think, 8 total moots happening between August and December of this year. So it's going to be pretty cool. So anyway, there's much more to come here, so you can keep an eye here on the events tab for that. But of course, if you look at space, there's lots of things to check out here. If we just take a quick glance through the modules that we're running in March. So first we look at the menu here and we see that there's 2 different categories of space modules. Some of our space modules are series, right? So you can learn languages. So if I scroll down, if I look at the ongoing cohorts, most of these are language classes. So you can see that we're currently teaching a cohort of people. We've got a cohort running for Ancient Greek, Biblical Hebrew, a couple Japanese, Latin, did I already say Latin? No, that was Greek. Yeah, Latin, Middle High German, and Old Norse. So those are languages that we already have running, and they are moving through. But of course, there's a bunch of ones. The Jump In Ready modules are ones that you can start up right away, and those include new languages that we're beginning, in fact. So you could find, for instance, it is the perfect time to begin if you've ever wanted to learn Old English and you've never learned Old English yet, if you still can't read Beowulf and, you want to kind of, you've always been curious about that. Now's the perfect time. We're starting up a new Old English cohort in March, this coming month. And we've got a whole bunch of really awesome literature ones. We've got Amy Sturgis teaching a modern fiction one on Last Seen Wearing. You've got her. She's also doing a Star Wars one on Andor season 2. We've got Julian Barr's Signum Classics Dracula one where with the special edition that we're publishing through the Signum University Press, with Sarah Brown as a guest lecturer for Julian in that class. And of course, Sarah is doing one of her own modules, Tolkien as Mythmaker, the Architecture of Middle-earth. How cool does that sound? So many cool things. And not to mention our creative writing workshop. This is one of our original, we do a lot of creative writing stuff. This is a perfect place to get started. If you are a writer or you want to be a writer and you are, and you would love to have a genuinely caring and supportive community who will really push you and teach you and help you while understanding you and being sympathetic with you, man, you should give our space creative writing modules a shot. And indeed, we have a number of language modules that I don't know anybody else offers anything of this kind. We have a number of intermediate classes, by which I mean these are just maintenance classes. So for people who know a language already, like, for instance, our Advanced Old English series. Dr. Swain has been running this for a while. We've been teaching Old English at Signum for many years now, and so there are lots of people now who have studied Old English with us. But of course, as anyone who has learned a language, especially, a dead language, will tell you, when you learn it, you've got to keep doing it or else you lose it. And so this is a class, the Advanced Old English series is a class that is simply designed for people who already know the language and don't want to forget it. And so it's a place to get together with other people who know Old English, and you can read. Dr. Swain has been going through almost the entire corpus of Old English literature. I was talking with him recently. I'm like, how long is it going to be before you will have read in the Advanced Old English series, like the entire corpus? You've taught the entire corpus of Old English. And the other cool thing about this is it means that you get a chance to read stuff in Old English that you never do in classes, like ever, right? Like, you learn Old English and you take Old English classes and you do Beowulf and you do the Wanderer and you do the Seafarer, maybe the Dream of the Rood, but it's a pretty small, Battle of Malden. There's a pretty small group of texts that like everybody reads and everybody knows, but there's a lot more out there, right? And there's just no time to get to it in a normal Old English curriculum. But pop into the Advanced Old English reading series and you can get all kinds of things, right? Anyway, it's just one example, another example of the cool stuff that's happening. Ooh, yeah, and Brenton's class. Look at this. Brenton is starting a series of space modules on Narnia. Brenton Dickinson, I don't know if you know Brenton Dickinson. He's a marvelous C.S. Lewis scholar. He is really an expert in C.S. Lewis and just a wonderful guy. It has been he's been teaching at Signum now for several years. And so he's starting a trip through the Chronicles of Narnia. So part 1, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, as it should be, is happening in March. So anyway, this is the fun stuff that is going on here in space, Viking history, all kinds of things. So again, you can check this out. This is under current and upcoming modules, February, March, April. You can see the immediate upcoming things. There's more things you can do. You can you can browse through all the modules that we have. You can look through our preceptors. You can request things. It's pretty fun. Yeah. Garth Galerius, that is absolutely what we do at Signum. Our university is based on the sheer love of learning. It is not, I respect the work that other universities do to prepare people for careers. Career prep is important. Young people need to get career prep. People who want to change careers will need career prep. And that's great. And I'm glad traditional higher education is there for them, though I wish it could be there for them at a slightly more reasonable price. However, there are other things. There are other things in life. Learning is about more than just career prep, learning is an important part of life, and not just the part of your life like between 18 and 22 or whatever, right? Learning is something you should be continuing to do through your whole life. And learning should always be about pursuing your passions and your interests, and you never know where those are going to take you and what new vistas those things are going to open up to you. So that's pretty much what Signum is about. All right. Let us get back in. Jackie's here now. So Jackie, we're just about to start. I know. For those who are not in real time, for those who are watching this on a recording, I started like 20 minutes earlier today than I have been starting for like the last several months. So I've kind of taken everybody by surprise here today. But anyway, let's go. Because again, my goal is to finish the Of Dwarves and Men chapter at the beginning of the late writings. We'll see. I got a whole bunch of slides to get through, so we'll see how we do. But let's go. Let's continue roaming and wandering. I called today's class Connecting the Old and the New, because to me, one of the really fun things about this, and again, I love these late essays. And by the way, I think if you really want to like understand how Tolkien's mind and how Tolkien's creative process works, there's nothing better to read than these late rambling quasi-philological essays. This shows you how Tolkien's mind works, and you can see these stories growing. And my sort of favorite thing, big picture, about what he's doing here in the latter portions of this first chapter of this long essay in sort of two parts, is how he's especially looking at Eriador and Rovanion. So like, he's looking at the lands in which the Lord of the Rings take place. But he's kind of frequently taking a step back and trying to connect the dots between the Beleriand of the Silmarillion and the Silmarillion stories and the Lord of the Rings. So you've got like these two islands in a sense. The story of the development of Tolkien's world has always been kind of like that, right? It was started with the First Age. It started with the elf stories and legends that he was writing, the myth making that he is doing about the beginning. And then there were some ideas, of course, about the sequel. Like the Numenor story has its roots way back, and he was interested in that, doing the Atlantis myth and that kind of thing. But it wasn't as... There wasn't that same sense, nothing certainly of the proportion of the First Age, of like the continuing ongoing history, right? There was just this other thing that he was kind of interested in, but it kind of floated on its own a little bit, right? And then, of course, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings come around and start filling in the Third Age at the end. And the Second Age was always, we've talked about this before, this kind of gap in the middle that needed to be filled in. And it was, of course, that process more than anything that I found so painful in our reading of the appendices, the formulation of the appendices, because that was exactly the place where all those stories were growing and blossoming and wanting to fill in that gap, but which had to be, hammered down and prevented from gaining life so that he could fit it into an appendix, right? Which is sad. Here now we can see him going over the whole thing, making those connections, showing the links and getting a sense of the larger history, both historical and linguistic, that links the Elder Days through to the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. So anyway, let's get back into it. We were in the middle of the dwarf stuff, so let's get back to the dwarves. We ended last time talking about Durin wandering alone and the mythic significance of that. Okay, anyway. All right, here we go. The first had been in the north of Eredland, in the first of the dwarf holds, the places where the dwarves lived. The great eastern wall of Beleriand, of which the blue mountains of the second and later ages were the remnant. The second had been Mount Gundabad, in origin a Khuzdul name, which was therefore revered by the dwarves, and its occupation in the Third Age by the orcs of Sauron was one of the chief reasons for their great hatred of the orcs. The other two places were eastward, at distances as great or greater than that between the Blue Mountains and Gundabad, the arising of the Iron Fists and Stiffbeards, and that of the Blacklocks and Stonefoots. Though these 4 points were far sundered, the dwarves of different kinds were in communication, and in early ages often held assemblies of delegates at Mount Gundabad. In times of great need, even the most distant would send help to any of their people, as was the case in the Great War against the orcs. Okay, so a couple things that I will note. First of all, keep in mind this is the place where he reinvents Gundabad. The word Gundabad goes back to The Hobbit. We are told that Mount Gundabad in the north of the Misty Mountains is the home base of the goblins. That's like ultimately where the goblin horde comes from, that is destroyed at the Battle of Five Armies. So Mount Gundabad is an orc hold, and there's no implication in The Hobbit or for long afterwards that it's anything else. This is the first clue. Tolkien is looking at that, and Tolkien decides, and my suspicion, this is just a suspicion, this is me guessing, but based on what he's been saying, like, this is me trying to follow like his train of thought in some ways, right? He's talking about the fathers of the dwarves and their ancient halls. I think that he found himself, when it came to it, resistant to the idea that Gundabad was this stronghold made by the orcs, and seemed to feel that it sort of fit the orcs better for them to take over a place that was built by the dwarves. And so he doesn't change history. Like, it's still the stronghold of the orcs. Later on, like, all the stuff in The Hobbit is exactly correct, still. So again, he's not making any changes, but he adds that layer of history to it and says that, okay, so yes, the orcs Gundabad was their capital, but it wasn't theirs originally. It was built by so partly I think this seems to me to be a way of, it certainly fits the pattern of, evil can corrupt, but doesn't make, right? And of course, like, it's not to say that Sauron or Morgoth can't build strongholds, but again, it's in their scale, the orcs are not making a stronghold, they're corrupting it. So that, I think, is one impulse. This kind of centrality of Mount Gundabad, that it was the place of assemblies where all of the the leaders of the 7 dwarf tribes would meet, gives it this specialness, right? So again, this is Gundabad is another fun example of him taking a concept that's in a published text. It doesn't come into the Lord of the Rings much at all. I mean, it doesn't come into the Hobbit that much either, but it's mentioned kind of prominently a couple times, which is, I think, more that happens in the Lord of the Rings. But anyway, so you can see him taking these references and sitting down to say, so what's the history of that? Where did that come from? And as he's thinking about these dwarf holds in the north, remember this follows, I think it follows, him saying that the dwarves originally awoke in the north instead of in the east. So that seems to be another thing that makes him think, like, Gundabad probably dwarvish originally. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing, Christopher notes this also, but I didn't talk about it much last time, and I'm not quite sure what to say about it. But it is an interesting thing that, like, as a sort of, I don't know what, inverse corollary to the Durin alone myth, or in some sense as an augmentation of the Durin alone myth. Durin is the only dwarf who's alone. All of the other dwarfs are in community. The dwarves, so you've got not only do the other dwarf fathers wake up with a spouse right there? And Durin does not. But you'll remember in that one note, Christopher was noting that Tolkien was considering a significant change to have a bunch of other dwarves awaken at the same time as most of the seven fathers, right? I think we talked about that last time, I think. In other words, it wasn't just the 7 or even 13 dwarves. That is 7 boys and 6 girls, right? That awakened originally. But those 13 plus like a passel of others, except for Durin. Again, so like the more he puts the rest of the dwarves in companionship, right, the more alone Durin gets and the more significant that seems to become. And I agree with you, Adam, that the dwarf mothers get short shrift. That is certainly true. Okay. All right. Hang on, JJ. Let's see. JJ says that Gundabad is mentioned once in the Return of the King. Is it in the appendices? It's not in the main text. Yeah, it's in the appendices. Okay, that's what I thought. All right. Well, that's what I was talking about. I was talking about the story. Gundabad is in the story of The Hobbit, like comes up in the narrative of The Hobbit and does not come up in the narrative of The Lord of the Rings. Yeah. Oh, interesting. And when it is brought up in the appendices, it's only brought up as like a geographical boundary. When all was ready, they assailed and sacked one by one all the strongholds of the orcs they could find, from Gundabad to the Gladden. Both sides were pitiless, and there was death and cruel deeds by dark and light. Description of the dwarf and orc wars, of course. Yeah. So Emily has a question about dwarvish reincarnation. It's really hard to answer questions about that because Tolkien only talks about that in a couple places. I will content myself for saying here that it's interesting that he does not talk about that here. Like notice it did not come up once during all of the discussion he was having about the dwarves and even about Durin. He doesn't talk about it. Yeah. Anyway, but notice one last thing about the companionship of the other dwarves and the loneliness of Durin is that all of the other 6 dwarf kindreds are paired. I mean, you got Belagast and Nogrod as a pair in the Blue Mountains, right? The Broadbeams and the Firebeards. But then you've got the Iron Fists and Stiffbeards and the Blacklocks and Stonefoots, who also seem to live more or less in pairs. Not necessarily in the same place, but proximate to each other, in relationship with each other. Leaving, once again, not only Durin personally, but the Longbeards as a kindred alone. More alone than all the other dwarves, right? So I get that. In part, to me, this just really augments the observation that we were talking about last time. There is clearly, he is making choice after choice after choice to emphasize the loneliness of Durin and the Longbeards, comparatively speaking. And so whatever it was he saw in that, whatever it is he was sort of invoking through that. Tomas, he does mention them in pairs, and it could just be that it sounds better in pairs. But no, Christopher mentioned in one of his other notes that they're actually living together. And I think that's implied here too. The other 2 places were eastward, so there are 2 places where the other dwarves look. The 4 other dwarf kindreds lived in 2 places. And I think that's why he's pairing them there. Anyway, yeah, so it's a thing. I don't claim to fully understand it. It's something that's worth thinking about a lot more. And we thought about it a bit last time, but It's definitely a thing. All right. Let's talk about language change. Because, of course, as Tolkien readers, right, as faithful Tolkien readers who are ready to be interested in everything that Tolkien is interested in, we're ready to hear about language change. According to their legends, their begetter, Aule the Vala, had made this, that is their language, for them and had taught it to the seven fathers before they were laid to sleep until the time for their awakening should come. After their awakening, this language, as all languages and all other things in Arda, changed in time, and divergently in the mansions that were far sundered. But the change was so slow, and the divergence so small, that even in the Third Age, converse between all dwarves in their own tongue was easy. As they said, the change in Khuzdul as compared with the tongues of the elves, and still more with those of men, was like the weathering of hard rock compared with the melting of snow. So remember, Tolkien will provide this context. He will provide a piece of real world context. Not here. He does it many pages later when talking similarly about language change later on among men. But I think it's when he's talking about the common speech in Adunaic. But he points out that when two peoples in the real world are separated for 500 years, their languages diverge very noticeably. And if they're separated for 1,500 years, the difference between their two languages after 1,500 years of divergence is most likely the languages will not only not be intelligible, they won't even be recognizable as being related to each other except by philologists, basically. And so just to kind of remember that real world reality and note that what he is talking about here, he is suggesting that dwarves living in far-flung mansions of the dwarves, separated by a large space of distance, and for an enormous stretch of time, thousands and thousands of years, like, I don't know what, 8, 9, 10,000 years or more, potentially? Depending on exactly how far back this goes in the sort of time of the stars, right? And so, yes, so Tolkien is imagining that after somewhere between 5 and 10,000 years of separation, two speakers who would still be able to there would be differences, but they would still be able to understand each other. That's slow, right? That's very, very like the weathering of hard rock compared to the melting of snow, right? Not like the weathering of hard rock compared to the weathering of, sandstone, or the weathering of hard rock compared to, the rotting of wood even, or something like that. It's the melting of snow, right? So he is pointing to a radical change. Also, the elves get all cutesy with their language, right? The Elvish languages change less than the dwarves' language changes. Not because the elves themselves change more, but because the elves are more creative with it. The elves mess with it. They enjoy changing their language. Some of the changes is, I was going to say accidental, is, just sort of the natural change of things in Middle-earth. But but some of the change is deliberate on their part. Anyway, let's keep going. But in far distant days, the dwarves were secretive, struck out, and none more so than the Longbeards. So he changed his mind about that, right? He crossed that out. Though again, like all of Tolkien's crossouts, I don't know that means he necessarily decided that Longbeards weren't more secretive than the rest, but maybe thought that it flowed better not to interject that here, right? So it's possible that, you know, he had the idea of the Longbeards being more secretive than the norm among dwarves. He might have changed that notion, or he might not. And few had dealings with the elves. In the west at the end of the First Age, the dealings of the dwarves of the arid Linden with King Fingal ended in disaster and the ruin of Doriath, the memory of which still poisoned the relations of elves and dwarves in after ages. At that time, the migrations of men from the east and south had brought advance guards into Beleriand, but they were not in great numbers. Though further east in Eriador and Rovanion, especially in the northern parts, their kindred must already have occupied much of the land. Their dealings between men and the Longbeards must soon have begun. For the Longbeards, though the proudest of the seven kindred, were also the wisest and the most far-seeing. Men held them in awe and were eager to learn from them, and the Longbeards were very willing to use men for their own purposes. Thus there grew up in those regions the economy, later characteristic of the dealings of dwarves and men, including hobbits. Men became the chief providers of food, as herdsmen, shepherds, and land tillers, which the dwarves exchanged for work as builders, road makers, miners, and the makers of things of craft, from useful tools to weapons and arms, and many other things of great cost and skill, to the great profit of the dwarves. No toys, Tomas. No toys. We're not in The Hobbit anymore. So, first observation, just note how this is a wonderful example of what I was describing, Tolkien filling in those blanks, right? Just think of how all of these things separately. The dwarves have emerged from their, the few stories in which they are not often very flatteringly involved in the earlier stories of the Silmarillion, through The Hobbit to, this, what I call Dwarves 4.0. Gimli is like Dwarf 4.0 in Tolkien's imagination. And then, of course, Appendix A, right, and the people of Durin, and he now has this clearer idea. But Appendix A, Durin's folk, just kind of sort of floats there, disconnected from all of the other stories and things, right? And so here we have, he's situated them geographically, and now he's bringing in the migration of the humans, and now he's beginning to imagine how will the dwarves and humans have begun interacting in those ancient days, right? Yeah. And Maureen, there he is talking about economy. I don't know if this, it doesn't contain any explicit tax policies, so I'm not sure if this would absolutely satisfy George R.R. Martin, but there we go. Yes, he does talk about this. And note that as he implies, when he talks about including hobbits there, we can see in places, in earlier writings, where his mind is already thinking this way. The Dwarf Road goes right through the Shire, right? So the dwarves built a road that goes right through the Shire. Maybe the Shire grew up around a pre-existing dwarf road. Maybe the dwarves built it afterwards. The dwarves clearly know of the hobbits. We can hear, especially in the Quest of Erebor material. So that, of course, was when he was working on Appendix A. Right? We can hear in the Quest of Erebor material that Thorin speaks very slightingly of the hobbits, right? He doesn't respect them very much. But it's clear he associates them with being land tillers. They're clearly known and presumably useful as well. Yes. Maureen, I was trying to hold off from making any unkind comments about George R.R. Martin not being in a place to critique anyone's completed epic. Yes, absolutely. Anyway, so yes, he's doing once again you can see, and this is one of the things that for me makes these essays so much fun, is that in every paragraph like this, you can, if you know and if you remember Tolkien's earlier writings well, whether it be the earlier Silmarillion material or The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, the appendices, even the like unfinished tales stuff, because almost all of that is before this. If you know that stuff really well, you can remember, you can like, I was about to say see the references. He's not exactly making references, but you can see the seeds. Like you can see what he's dealing with, right? You can remember what he's referring back to and see him filling in the cracks. And I think that's really fun. Yeah. Anyway, but notice that final comment. So my subtitle for this slide was Dwarves Not Being Heroes, which was prompted by that very last sentence fragment, to the great prophet of the dwarves, which seems to be a nod back to the comment in the Hobbits about dwarves not being heroes, but being folk with a high opinion of the value of money. In other words, he has progressed. His ideas of dwarves have progressed beyond what they were in The Hobbit, and therefore in the Quentin Olderenwa and the 1937 Quentin Silmarillion, which is his contemporary imaginations of dwarves when he was writing The Hobbit. His ideas of dwarves have gone, like Thorin Oakenshield is already beyond that by the time he gets to his deathbed in The Hobbit. He's already, I say Gimli is Dwarf 4.0. Perhaps I should say Gimli is like the poster child of Dwarf 4.0. But Thorin Oakenshield on his deathbed is the prototype, is the first, the original, the father of Dwarf 4.0. But in any case, notice once again, I think that his comment about the prophet of the dwarves here is a nod back to The Hobbit. Like he's even passages like that in his published text. He is, we've talked about how he is taking his published text as a kind of fixed point, right? Well, that passage in The Hobbit that I'm alluding to is one of those asides by the narrator, one of those pieces of commentary in the voice of the narrator of the book, which were exactly the things that Tolkien tried to distance himself from most later on in his life, or I guess I should say 15 years prior to this, right? There was that time in his life when he was annoyed about The Hobbit and kind of really wished that he had done it differently or would have done it differently. And yet, despite the fact that the passage in question, A, reflects an earlier conception of the dwarves, which is they've already grown and developed past that, and B, was only an opinion given in the mouth of the narrator whose intrusiveness Tolkien kind of regretted, yet he's still reconciling this with that, right? Yes, the dwarves dealt shrewdly with their early human allies, and got the better of the bargain. They didn't have to grow any food. All they had to do was make some tools and weapons and, other things. He says things of great cost and skill. And I wonder whose cost. They might cost the dwarves a lot to make, maybe. But it sounds like they cost the humans even more to acquire. Yeah. Anyway, Yeah. And yeah, I agree. The great prophet seems to be throwing just a touch of shade, Maureen, at the dwarves. Again, in keeping with that famous paragraph from The Hobbit. Yeah. And no, Adam, I'm not saying it's one-sided. I agree. Superior tech in exchange for food is not exactly a one-sided trade. But again, Tolkien is emphasizing that the dwarves profited greatly. He doesn't say wildly disproportionately. He doesn't say that they were fleecing the humans and the hobbits. Just that they profited greatly from this. So yeah, yeah. Um, let's but let's keep going. I'm on a quest to finish this chapter tonight. Okay, sorry. Often when I quote a Tolkien has a habit, especially in these essays, of using demonstrative pronouns at the beginning of these paragraphs. Like, this system developed slowly. And so when I've quoted this passage, sometimes I'm like, wait, what's this again? It's I think he's talking about the writing, isn't he? This no. It's the system of adopting names from their from their from the languages of the people they live nearby. That's the system in question. Okay, sorry. Here we go. This system developed slowly, and it was long before the Longbeards felt any need to learn the language of their neighbors, still less to adopt names by which they could be known individually to outsiders. This process began not in barter and trade, but in war. For the Longbeards had spread southward down the vales of Anduin, and had made their chief mansion and stronghold at Moria, and also eastward to the Iron Hills, where the mines were their chief source of iron ore. They regarded the Iron Hills, the arid Mithrin, as the east dales of the Misty Mountains as their own land. But they were under attack from the orcs of Morgoth. During the War of the Jewels and the siege of Angband, when Morgoth needed all his strength, these attacks ceased. But when Morgoth fell and Angband was destroyed, hosts of orcs fled eastwards, seeking homes. They were now masterless and without any general leadership, but they were well armed and very numerous, cruel, savage, and reckless in assault. In the battles that followed, the dwarves were outnumbered, and though they were the most redoubtable warriors of all the speaking peoples, they were glad to make alliance with men. Now, the sentence, this process began not in barter and trade, but in war, made me a little nervous at first, in the sense that I thought he was, it sounds at first right like he's going to go on and describe how the elves were at war with the humans, and that was like their first linguistic connection. But no, it's as allies. And here, once again, you see the new and the old being linked, right? What was the impact on Eriador and Rovanion of the downfall of Morgoth? Questions never answered in the Silmarillion anywhere. Nowhere in the published, so not even in Of Rings of Power in the Third Age is that really not like this, like not the immediate aftermath. But yeah, so we get the orcs swarming over them, the now masterless orcs swarming over them, and them needing allies. Because, of course, the humans have something the dwarves do not have, and that is cavalry, right? The men with whom they were thus associated were, for the most part, akin in race and language with the tall and mostly fair-haired people of the House of Hador, the most renowned and numerous of the Edain, who were allied with the Eldar in the War of the Jewels. These men, it seems, had come westward until faced by the great Greenwood, and then had divided, some reaching the Anduin and passing thence northward up the vales, some passing between the north eaves of the wood and the arid Mithrin. Only a small part of this people, already very numerous and divided into many tribes, had then passed into Eriador and so come at last to Beleriand. So this, of course, is the explanation of how the Rohirrim are related to the Edain but weren't Edain, right? They weren't one of the kindreds who fought with the elves in Beleriand, but they were related to them because, like the Teleri before them, the third kindred of the Edain, the third and largest kindred of the Edain, the House of Hador, came slowly and split and all that stuff, right? And left some behind in the greater Mirkwood area. Though, whereas the Sylvan elves who stayed behind in that region lived in the forest, the humans from the House of Hador who stayed behind on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains lived all around the forest, right? Okay, wait, where was I? Right, there I am. Okay. They were brave and loyal folk, true-hearted, haters of Morgoth and his servants, and at first had regarded the dwarves askance, fearing that they were under the shadow, as they said. So when I go through long passages like this, I'll try to pause. I just talked about those all of the places, how much fun it is to read through this and hear the echoes, and feel like I'm getting the cross references, right? Here's one. At first regarded the dwarves askance, fearing that they were under the shadow. Yeah, well, that's probably where some of those other stories about the dwarves came from. Because remember, Tolkien doesn't only preserve the published texts. He is similarly retentive of his drafts and things too. He remembers that there exist in his drawers and boxes somewhere many versions of stories in which the dwarves are either said to be or are merely assumed to be allies of Melkor. Or, maybe they're weapons dealers to both sides and just war profiteers. That's Dwarves 2.0 from the Quentin Ilderinwa. So, yeah. In fact, there are a bunch of stories like that. Tolkien wrote most of them. This is the same thing he did. So remember that reference in Appendix A near the end of Durin's Folk where it says that some among people had said that the dwarves didn't have any children, but they sprang from the stone and then returned to the stone when they died. Right? Remember that? And it's really fun because he's doing the same thing there. Right? Tolkien himself said that. Like there was one man in particular who told stories about that happening from the dwarves. And it was Tolkien back in his earlier writings. He's rethought that, but he's kept the notion that he has rejected, but he's kept it around as legend. And alludes to it as legend. And I think that that's exactly what is going on here. But they were glad of the alliance, for they were more vulnerable to the attacks of the orcs. That is, the humans, of course. They dwelt largely in scattered homesteads and villages, and if they drew together into small townships, they were poorly defended, at best by dikes and wooden fences. Also they were lightly armed, chiefly with bows, for they had little metal, and the few smiths among them had no great skill. These things the dwarves amended in return for one great service that men could offer. They were tamers of beasts, and had learned the mastery of horses, and many were skilled and fearless riders. These would often ride far afield as scouts, and keep watch on movements of their enemies, and if the orcs dared to assemble in the open for some great raid, they would gather great force of horsed archers to surround them and destroy them. A lot like the Rohirrim do with Ugluk, right? In these ways, the alliance of dwarves and men in the north came early in the Second Age to command great strength, swift in attack and valiant and well protected in defense, and there grew up in that region between dwarves and men respect and esteem, and sometimes warm friendship. The alliance of dwarves and men in the north. That has lots of capital letters. And so all of a sudden now, that's a thing, right? The alliance of dwarves and men in the north, like that's official. That's a story now, right? You could put that in a chronology now, probably. At this time, the alliance of dwarves and men in the north was thriving, right? And Green Grey Dragon, this is an excellent arrangement, right? Again, notice how also another thing that I would point out, another sort of trend of Tolkien's thought that I would point out here, is notice how, as was his wont in his later years, he is thinking much more practically about the world-building aspects of his history. Of course, I don't need to remind y'all of the nature of Middle-earth and the all the tables of lifespans and generational cycles and things, right? But we know that Tolkien, by this stage in his life, had for a couple decades now, been thinking much, much more. Ever since really he finished The Lord of the Rings, he had kind of gotten the world building bug, which, for all Tolkien's reputation as a peerless world builder, he did not have prior to. I still maintain he did not have a penchant for world building in itself. The world grew in his stories, and he was very sensitive to that. But he did not sit down and plan out his world. But we see him doing this, right? Imagining humans who came from the West, who have been a wandering people for many generations, because these people, the proto House of Hador, who have been fleeing from the Morgoth loyalists who rule in the East. And so the good guys have been moving west. The rebels against the Morgoth worshippers have been moving west. So they've been this itinerant migrant peoples. They, without allies, they wouldn't have any metal, or much metal in any case, right? And so he's imagining their culture, and he's imagining the dwarves, and then the connection between the two of them, right? And so notice also how this helps to explain another thing. We're going to come back, I hope, before we're done tonight, to Tolkien's concept of the middlemen, right? You've got the Númenórean, the high men, and the men of darkness, and then you've got the middlemen in the middle, which, when Faramir introduced those categories, he was thinking of the Rohirrim, but said that, like, the Gondorians have kind of gotten more middle-ish over time as well. More middling, I guess, perhaps would be the adjective. Anyway, where is the distinction? Again, Tolkien's going to talk about this explicitly later on in this essay. He'll get around to actually talking about it. But notice how you can see the framework being laid, right? Even before Númenor. Even before the Númenóreans come back and, with kindly intentions at first, share their technology with the remaining men in Middle-earth, these men are already differentiating themselves from some of the other peoples because they've made allies with the dwarves, who now can supply them with amazing things like metallic weapons and armor and tools. Yeah. So Belfengos, I agree that originally the world building was incidental to the development of the language. Yes, the development of the languages is what drove the stories. But afterwards, it shifts, right? Post Lord of the Rings is where we see him doing all of this world building, even when it's only loosely connected with the language. Okay, so this is awesome. This is great fun. This is the passage I referred to. This is the passage we didn't get to last time that I was talking about. Fleshing it out, Maureen. Yes, and he's fleshing out this really big picture, and he's creating a much, much richer history. A much richer history of, especially, of Eriador and Rovanion, right? Of the lands of the Lord of the Rings. He's got Beleriand relatively well worked out, right? But what happened here? And so, note, this is First Age stuff. We're reading about this alliance of dwarves and men in the north is in the First Age. And in the early Second Age, it came to command great strength. Okay, no. So it begins, the influx begins in the First Age. The real alliance comes in the beginning of the Second Age, when the unmastered orcs of Morgoth come pouring in. But still, it starts, like, it predates the arrival of the men of Hador to Beleriand. That is, their arrival in this area, right? Garth Galerius, I'm trying to think about that. If anyone in Middle-earth ever used bronze for weapons. Possibly in the East. But I'm trying to think of examples, and I can't think of it because the problem is the dwarves. The dwarves are always there, right? The dwarves in their steel are there from the beginning. Like that. Remember that even happens in Beleriand with the trade between Doriath and the dwarves, right? And here we're seeing it with the humans. Even before Numenor is founded, they begin their first encounters with the dwarves. And yes, David Michael Tolkien does not describe a lot of things. The absence of his discussion of bronze tools does not say that there weren't any. But again, just based upon what he describes, I mean, was there a time when the dwarves were only working in bronze and not in iron? Possibly, but no hint of that is given. And I think there are some indications that that's definitely not true. So yeah, I think that he is imagining part of the difference of having elves and dwarves alongside humans in the world. One of the consequences, it seems, is that Tolkien is not assuming that the same progression, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, that same cultural progression has to be gone through in exactly that way. These Proto-Edain here are David Michael, as you were saying before, they're described as basically almost like Neolithic culture. And so, yeah, they seem to be going from Neolithic to Iron Age almost right away because dwarves, right? And yeah, anyway. And that's interesting. That's fun, I think. He's not, in other words, to say that a different way, I think he is being less, while he is taking his own published texts primarily and his unpublished texts secondarily as a primary source here, he is thinking in terms of our familiar world history and our, sort of prehistoric cultures and things. But he's not taking that as a text that has to be adhered to. I think he's willing to skip the Bronze Age. Let's pretend the Bronze Age didn't... He's not willing to pretend that, like, the Hobbit narrator didn't say that thing about dwarves not being heroes, but he is willing to pretend the Bronze Age never happened, right? Priorities. Okay. But that seems to be part of the rules of the game that he's playing here. It was at that time, when the dwarves were associated with men both in war and in the ordering of the lands that they had secured, that the Longbeards adopted the speech of men for communication with them. They were not unwilling to teach their own tongue to men with whom they had a special friendship, but men found it difficult and were slow to learn more than isolated words, many of which they adapted and took into their own language, says the philologist. The philologist assures us. But on one point, the Longbeards were as rigidly secretive as all other dwarves. For reasons which neither elves nor men ever fully understood, they would not reveal any personal names to people of other kin, nor later, when they had acquired the arts of writing, allow them ever to be carved or written. Carved or written. What's he thinking of? Nor later, when they had acquired the arts of writing, allow them to be carved or written? Like, not even on tombs, probably. Yeah. Awesome. They therefore took names by which they could be known to their allies in mannish forms. This custom endured among the Longbeards into the Fourth Age and beyond the view of these histories. It would appear that when speaking to men with whom they had close friendship, it would appear that when speaking to men with whom they had close friendship and would speak together of the histories and memories of their peoples, they also gave similar names to dwarves remembered in their annals long before the meeting of dwarves and men. So when they're talking, so they not only made up fake names for themselves, they invented fake names for their ancestors, so that when they were talking about ancient dwarves of old, they didn't give their secret names either. So even posthumously, you can't reveal a dwarf's true name to a non-dwarf. Which means, like, in writing, anywhere. But they're making up fake names for their ancestors. But of these ancient times, only one name was in the Third Age preserved: Durin, the name they gave to the prime ancestor of the Longbeards, and by which he was known to elves and men. It appears to have been simply a word for king in the language of the men of the north of the Second Age. The names of the Longbeards otherwise are not known in lists going back before the ruin of Moria, Khazad-dûm, Third Age 1980, but they are all of the same kind. That is, in a long-dead Mannish language, a.k.a. Old Norse. Maureen, that is a genius retcon of Durin. Genius! Because, okay, the idea that we saw before, Tolkien had first to answer the question, why do the dwarves have Old Norse names? Now, of course, we know the real answer to that question, because when he wrote The Hobbit, he just took the names from Old Norse, right? He just took them right out of the Voluspa. In the Voluspa, there's a long list of dwarf names. And so when he wanted to make a list of dwarf names in chapter 1 of The Hobbit, he opened up the Voluspa and started writing names, with the one puzzling exception of Balin, who, of course, not in the Voluspa. But anyway, that's still a mystery I would love to know the answer to. Balin. John Ratliff talks about Sir Balin from Sir Thomas Malory, but I totally reject that connection. I cannot imagine that. I find that totally unpersuasive. Like, I remember well the story of Sir Balin, and I see no link of any kind between Balin the dwarf and that. But anyway, but I don't want to get sidetracked on that riddle, to which there is no clue in this passage. Anyway, the point is, we know that that's where they came from. But of course, we also know that later on, Tolkien was like, okay, I got to explain why the dwarves all have these Norse names, right? And so the brilliance of the general retcon, which he's mentioned in other places, but he explains in more detail here, is gorgeous, right? Because it fits with the linguistic thing in Middle-earth, right? Like how, because it doesn't just fit to say, well, it's in a human language because they took the names from the humans, the language of the humans they live near. It's not just that. It also fits within the translation thing, right? Where, like, the common speech has been translated into modern English, and so the older version, like the highly, highly archaic version of the common speech that the Rohirrim brought south with them from the north, is translated by ancient English, and an analog to it from a similar but separated people over in the northeastern portion of the forest, up by Dale, is translated by Old Norse. And so that's why the dwarves have Old Norse names. Problem solved, right? That's genius. But there's still the issue. Already raised and alluded to here in this passage again, the issue of Balin's tomb. But at the same time, but it's more than just the Balin's tomb issue, though. The big problem that he's solving here is places where dwarf names are mentioned that seem like they cannot possibly be explained by that. And Durin is the classic example. Durin sounds suspiciously like it fits with all the rest of the dwarf names, right? Yeah. Durin sounds like one of those. But why should it? Durin certainly, even if you imagine Durin did take a fake name from but like there weren't even humans, so that's not possible. And even if he had, it wouldn't be Old Norse. It would be, I don't know, like Proto-Indo-European or something like that, right? But yeah, so he, yeah. Anyway, so here's the explanation. So he's finally here, invented an explanation for how it is that Durin, of all people, does not have a Khuzdul name. Answer, he did, but you're never going to know it. This is a retconned fake name for Durin, made by the dwarves at the time when the human language was like Old Norse. I love how, and I didn't quote it, but in the following paragraph, he goes on to say that the language of the people around them changed more and more rapidly than the dwarves did, so that pretty soon their Old Norse names become separated from the people who lived around them, because the people who lived around them, languages changed way faster than they did. So like but they're like, oh, we shall continue like giving names of this kind. And so they preserved this like strange other genealogical name pool. Anyway, really, you could just, there you can see Tolkien the philologist just like having great fun with that. Right. But I think this is just genius, that the word Durin actually just means king. So they took the word for king and they're like, yeah, that's what we're going to call our father of the Khuzdul name, whom we will never mention. And that's why he's called Durin everywhere. Yeah, no, JJ, the idea is they chose Durin and he's Durin forever. Because remember, the dwarves don't do that whole language change thing, right? Yeah, exactly, David Michael. This whole tradition of the foreign language dwarf names, which become totally separate from the foreign language actually surrounding them. Yeah, it's really fun. Anyway, okay. We're doing great. So then Beleriand falls. Not Beleriand, sorry. Eriador. No, sorry. Eregion. That's the word I'm looking for. Eregion falls. This marked the end of the alliance of the Longbeards with men of the North. For though Moria remained impregnable for many centuries, the orcs, reinforced and commanded by servants of Sauron, invaded the mountains again. Gundabad was retaken, the arid Mithrin infested, and the communication between Moria and the Iron Hills for a time cut off. The men of the Alliance were involved in war not only with orcs, but with alien men of evil sort, that is Easterlings, coming over under Sauron's rule. For Sauron had acquired dominion over many savage tribes in the east, of old corrupted by Morgoth, and he now urged them to seek land and booty in the west. When the storm passed, the men of the old alliance were diminished and scattered, and those that lingered on in their old regions were impoverished and lived mostly in caves or in the borders of the forest. Once again, we see him taking this idea, right? What would have happened? Because if the dwarves lived here, then that means they would have encountered humans even before the Second Age. And how would that have worked? So we had that worked out, and now he's worked his way forward in like the main plot, right? The main known plot. So now we get to the War of Sauron and the Elves and the sack of Eregion, and whoop, that's gonna be the turning point, right? That's gonna be the change. No more alliance, because now the dwarves just have to. The doors of Moria are shut now, right? They're besieged. They're still safe in Moria. The orcs can't get in, but they're essentially besieged. They can't go anywhere. And therefore, no more alliance with the men, who all get conquered or defeated, or almost all get conquered or defeated. Yeah. the servants of Sauron that are commanding the orcs? I'm not quite sure. It's possible that he's referring to the Nazgul here, because this is post Rings of Power, just. But, or maybe they're not even Wraithified yet. Maybe it's the pre-Wraith Nazgul, the prequel Nazgul. I don't know what to call them, right? You can't exactly call them Nazgul yet because they're not really, well, sort of. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, the Nine Kings. Maybe those are the servants in question who are reinforcing and commanding the orcs, who are, still milling around here in this area. Now, since this is one of Tolkien's wandering philological essays, he wanders backwards, right? Having gotten up as far as towards the end of the Second Age, he stops and goes back all the way to Beleriand. And now he looks at Beleriand and the history that he has written several times now of the arrival of men in Beleriand, and he thinks about it from a different point of view and talks about it in a different way. The folk of Hador were ever the greatest in numbers of the Etani, and in renown, save only Beren, son of Barahir, descendant of Beor. For the most part they were tall people, with flaxen or golden hair and blue-grey eyes, but there were not a few among them that had dark hair, though all were fair-skinned. Nonetheless, they were akin to the folk of Beor, as was shown by their speech. It needed no lore of tongues to perceive that their languages were closely related, for although they could understand one another only with difficulty, they had very many words in common. The elvish lore masters were of opinion that both languages were descended from one that had diverged, owing to some division of the people who had spoken it, in the course of maybe 1,000 years in the slower change in the First Age. Though the time might well have been less, and change quickened by a mingling of peoples, for the language of Hador was apparently less changed and more uniform in style, whereas the language of Beor contained many elements that were alien in character. This contrast in speech was probably connected with the observable physical differences between the two peoples. There were fair-haired men and women among the folk of Beor, but most of them had brown hair, going usually with brown eyes, and many were less fair in skin, some indeed being swarthy. Men as tall as the folk of Hador were rare among them, and most were broader and more heavy in build. So, two things. One is that notice that he's simplified. This only really comes up in the notes. Christopher emphasizes it in the notes. But if you know even the published Silmarillion, you will have noticed that he's made some changes. He says explicitly in this passage that Hador, Haleth, and Beor were the three people who led these peoples into Beleriand. Even though it seems like perhaps he is qualifying Haleth and saying it was Haleth's dad, but she was there, but then she leads them afterwards. There's none of this people of Marach business that we get in the published Silmarillion. He's calling them the folk of Hador from the beginning and says that it was Hador who led them into Beleriand. So on the one hand, he is simplifying the story a bit from some of the earlier versions of the migrations that he told. Hador from jump. Again, no Marach. Beor, of course, was always the original, and also a similar kind of simplification of the people of Haleth as well. So that's one impulse, it seems, to kind of simplify those things a little bit, to simplify that history a little bit. Not wholly unlike to what we did in Silmfilm, actually, when we did that. But here's the other thing. He finds himself isn't quite right. he here takes the opportunity to avail himself of the opportunity to do something he did not do in the early versions, something he did not do in the earlier Silmarillion texts. And that is give a philological history to the three peoples. The stories of the elves, the three kindreds of the elves and their various history, like big picture wise, and in some cases the individual stories, but at least the big picture of the movement and migration and such of the elves, the progress to the west and the leaving some behind and then the others kind of catching up with them again, and then the separation to Valinor and the return from Valinor of some but not all, and all of that stuff, right? All of those things have their roots in Tolkien's own investigation of different philological situations and complexities of different circumstances under which languages can change differently over time, right? That came first. His invented languages and these kind of fun experiments he was doing with his invented languages came first, and those stories came afterwards. But not so with the humans. Why are there three kindreds of the elves? Why did they divide up into the groups that they did? Well, because of the linguistic differences that he wanted to establish. All of those things have a root in a linguistic situation that he wanted to create. So because the history of his invented languages dictated it, is ultimately the answer to the question, why are there three kindreds of the elves in the first place? But if we ask the question, why were there three peoples of the humans? Why were there three houses of men? The answer seems to be because there were three houses of elves. Like, it just seems to be parallelism. And we've noticed at many points in reading the history of Middle-earth and the nature of Middle-earth, Tolkien's repeated and indeed consistent idea of parallelism or symmetry, Jocelyn, as you say, between the elves and the humans. In other words, the three houses of the Edain in the original writings don't emerge organically. I mean, except in as much as they emerge from the elves, which is kind of sort of organic, but it's also not exactly organic. It's a little bit artificial, right? At least as far as the languages are concerned. They did not emerge. It does not have linguistic roots in the same way. So what's he doing here? What he's doing here is retconning them back in. Oh, well, let me explain about the linguistic situation that underlies the differentiation of the three houses of the Edain, right? They did not grow up out of that. He didn't start with his languages of the Edain, and then the stories of the Edain grew out of that, like he did with the elves. He is working on the languages for them, right? But isn't it where it started? Not like his elvish languages came before the stories. His human languages post-date the stories. They're retconned. They're motivated by the stories in order to fill them in. Exactly as Green Great Dragon says, those aftercomers. Yeah, that's the real reason why they're called the aftercomers. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And notice how he also begins to think of it not in genetic terms, but in physical characteristic terms as well. His talking about there being fair-haired men and women among the folk of Beor, and like all those things. What he's pointing to is evidence of intermingling. He's pointing to evidence. He's saying that not because he's interested in genetics, certainly, and he's saying this not because he's like, I think, especially cares about exactly what they look like. He's talking about this as evidence of what the underlying linguistic situation was, right? Why does it matter that there are fair-haired men and women among the folk of Beor? Because that shows that they had culturally encountered this other group of people, and therefore their languages are going to have borrowed, and there will be this certain linguistic situation that will have emerged, right? Yes. So, on the one hand, there's nothing new here. He's just talking about the three houses of the Edain. But this whole thing reads quite differently from the account that we get in the Silmarillion. Okay, a little footnote on mushrooms. So, by the way, it's right here in the midst of this, in the midst of his description of the people of Haleth, that he busts into the passage of prose which Christopher excerpted and put under the chapter title The Druidine in Unfinished Tales. So the entire Druidine section of Unfinished Tales gets lifted from exactly this part. So it's a digression within a digression. Within a digression. He's digressed to talking about the houses of the Edain, and he digresses to talking about the people, to giving more information about the people of Haleth, and then he digresses to talking about the Druidine who are connected with them, and then now suddenly we're telling the story of the Faithful Stone. A footnote within this is the mushroom passage. To the astonishment of elves and other men, they, that is the Druidine, ate funguses with pleasure, many of which looked to others ugly and dangerous. Some kinds which they specially liked they caused to grow near their dwellings. The Eldar did not eat these things. The folk of Haleth, taught by the Druidine, made some use of them at need, and if they were guests, they ate what was provided in courtesy and without fear. The other Atani eschewed them, save in great hunger when astray in the wild, for few among them had the knowledge to distinguish the wholesome from the bad, and the less wise called them orc plants, and supposed them to have been cursed and blighted by Morgoth. Which, if you have, ever seen like a whole bank of mushrooms grow in your yard overnight, it's easy to imagine how you can suppose them to have been cursed and blighted by Morgoth. Yeah, no, they're totally orc plants, Jackie. I mean, look at them. They're like weird and slimy and like they're like plants, but they're clearly not plants, right? They don't have leaves. Oh man. Yeah. Right. They multiply. Oh yeah, exactly. Like it's orc plants, totally orc plants. And they're poisonous, Maureen, or at least often, right? Especially if you lack the knowledge to distinguish the wholesome from the bad, right? They'll kill you in a heartbeat, right? So yeah, absolutely. Right now, JJ, Christopher explains in his note that in his own note, which surrounds this passage that he gives, that Tolkien rejected this. Tolkien crossed this out explicitly because he was trying to resist the connection. He didn't want to connect the Druidine and the Hobbits too closely together. And he thought that associating the Druidine specially with mushrooms was treading on dangerous ground. So yeah, that's for this reason. I kind of like it. I like this passage a lot, but I kind of like the vague, unconfirmed and unsubstantiated hint that the hobbits might have gained their love of mushrooms at some point in their cultural history from the Druidine. But Tolkien seems to have been concerned about identification between the two. and so played it safe and ditched this. Well, I say played it safe. None of this was published, of course. All right, but more on hobbits and droogs. The droogs or pukelmen are not, however, to be confused with or thought of as a mere variant on the hobbit theme. They were quite different in physical shape and appearance. Their average height, 4 feet, was only reached by exceptional hobbits. They were of heavier and stronger build, and their facial features, the they throughout here is the droogs, clearly. Sometimes Tolkien's pronouns can be a little challenging in these rambling writings. And their facial features were unlovely, judged by general human standards. Physically, they shared the hairlessness of the lower face, but while the head hair of the hobbits was abundant, but close and curly, the droogs had only sparse and lank hair on their heads, and none at all on their legs and feet. In character and temperament, they were at times merry and gay, like hobbits, but they had a grimmer side to their nature, and could be sardonic and ruthless, and they had or were credited with strange or magical powers. The tales, such as the Faithful Stone, that speak of their transferring part of their powers to their artifacts, remind one in miniature of Sauron's transference of power to the foundation of the Barad-dûr and to the ruling ring. Says Tolkien without further explanation. Also, the droogs were a frugal folk, and ate sparingly even in times of peace and plenty, and drank nothing but water. In some ways, they resembled rather the dwarves, in build and stature and endurance, though not in hair, and that's right, they're like the inverse of the dwarves in hair, in their skill in carving stone, in the grim side of their character, and in strange powers. Though the magic skills with which the dwarves were credited were quite different, also the dwarves were much grimmer, and they were long-lived, whereas the droogs were short-lived compared with other kinds of men. Okay. Yeah, I agree. Frugal does not seem to describe the hobbits much, and ate sparingly even in times of peace and plenty, and drank nothing but water, none of which things are notably said about hobbits anywhere. So notice there that we see this differentiation. So here he's trying to separate, right? The thesis of this paragraph is droogs or pukelmen are not to be confused with or thought of as a mere variant on the hobbit theme. They're not just like hobbits. Don't think of them as they're not proto-hobbits. They're not related to hobbits. Don't associate them with hobbits. They are another sort of sub-race of humans who are also short, like hobbits. But don't associate them together. Yeah, he seems awful concerned about this, even though, Jackie, I agree, there doesn't really seem to be apart from their height, much reason to do so. Tomas is theorizing that, of course, not drinking only water seems to make you live a great deal longer, right? For all of their frugality and temperance of food and drink, it doesn't seem to have done them much good, right? They're short-lived compared with other kinds of men who are shorter-lived than hobbits in general too. So, yeah. Well, Jocelyn, that's the funny thing. Jocelyn says, who was really stressing about the droogs anyway? Nobody ever heard. I mean, okay, we've got Khan, right? You know, we've got the wild men in the Lord of the Rings. So they're there, but like, I don't think anyone was like, oh, long lost cousins of the hobbits. Like it's hard in the Lord of the Rings. Even, yes, they're short. But I don't think very many Lord of the Rings readers emerge, you know, with a very strong temptation to closely associate Khan and the Woses with hobbits necessarily. Yeah. Yes, that's interesting. Green Great Dragon says the word strange always sticks out to me in Tolkien. Yes. Strange powers you're thinking of specifically? Yes. Yes. I agree. It's a word. It is one of those words which means, I think, different, well, more things and perhaps different things to Tolkien in Tolkien's usage than in our common usage. I think that is a good reminder, Green Grey Dragon. Yeah, A.D. Pirtle, you are correct. I think that's what I always felt too. A.D. Pirtle says the Droogs, the Woses, are so mysterious in The Lord of the Rings that the thought never occurred to me of associating them with the hobbits, since hobbits are the opposite of mysterious. Yes, the hobbits are the most friendly and familiar thing in Middle-earth, and the Woses are not. Right? So yes, I agree. There doesn't seem to be, but so I think the problem is not that Tolkien is fearing that everyone is going to be like, oh, everyone's going to think that Hanbori Khan is like a lost cousin of Mary, right? It's not that. But I think it's as he's developing the stories, especially of the Woses in the First Age, like when he's writing the Faithful Stone and stuff, right? So as he's projecting a backward history of the Woses and putting them back in the First Age, in Beleriand and even in Numenor, I think that's where he begins to get anxious about the association. Because I think what he is thinking, my guess is that what he is thinking, that we will think that hobbits came from them, because he doesn't explain where hobbits come from. Even in this essay. Even in this essay, when he is talking about, we'll get to it in just a minute, about the connections between hobbits and men, he still doesn't say anything about their ultimate origins. Okay, so they're closely related to men. But how did that happen? Why are there these pint-sized humans out there? What's the story? When did that happen? Why did that happen? How did that happen? Explain. He never explains, right? And so I think that the root, whatever anxiety he's having here for this association, I think that's the root of it. Because he's saying, I'm not going to explain where hobbits came from, but I don't want you to think they came from Droogs, that they came from Woses. That at least is my theory. Yeah. Good. Let's keep going. Here's what we get about the history of hobbits. Hobbits, on the other hand, were in nearly all respects normal men, but of very short stature. That's it. The end. Thank you. That's where hobbits came from. They're normal men, but short. I'm not going to explain how they got short. I'm not going to explain why they stayed short. Yeah. They were called halflings, but this refers to the normal height of men of Númenórean descent and of the Eldar, especially those of Nyoldarian descent, which appears to have been about 7 of our feet. Their height at the periods concerned was usually more than 3 feet for men, though very few ever exceeded 3'6". Women seldom exceeded 3 feet. You'll remember that isn't it in The Hobbit that he says they're sometimes 2 feet tall, but he's regularizing that now, right? Giving a more reasonable and consistent range. They were not as numerous or variable as ordinary men, but evidently more numerous and adaptable to different modes of life and habitat than the Droogs, and when they are first encountered in the histories, already showed divergences in coloring, stature, and build, and in their ways of life and preferences for different types of country to dwell in. See the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, the concerning Hobbit stuff about Stoors and Fallowhides and Harfoots, of course. In their unrecorded past, they must have been a primitive, indeed savage people, but when we meet with them, they had, in varying degrees, acquired many arts and customs by contact with men, and to a less extent with dwarves and elves. Notice he puts savage in quotation marks because, he doesn't mean that they were savage in the pejorative sense, right? Just savage in the sense of being technologically primitive. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I see this side conversation, Arthur, that you and Jocelyn are having. Score however you like. Everett is asking how much of a Darwinian Tolkien was. He's talking about speciation, but at a really fast pace. Tolkien was he was not much of a Darwinian. He was not ignorant of Darwinian theories. But I certainly do not get the impression that he feels himself under any pressure or indeed has very much desire to conform the history of his world with Darwinian theories. Everett, I think that's the short answer I'd give to that. Yeah, you can see things that are sort of like it, but not that is sort of like Darwinian concepts. But yeah, certainly not something that he is in any proper sense of this word relying on, really. Yeah. Yeah, and Eric, it probably is closer to a medieval idea of how people and creatures diverge and develop. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, 80 Pirtle says, and yet he was willing to rewrite everything to conform to geology. Well, but it's not just geology, it's astronomy also. Yeah. I mean, Tolkien was well aware that even the ancient Greeks knew that the world was round. That's his problem. That's what he's rewriting his works for, is that Tolkien knows full well that his concept of a flat earth was never believed by anybody and wasn't even a part of the fictitious history of the Middle Ages or the ancient world. So it is therefore, his myth of the flat earth is therefore totally detached from like almost all traditions of learning. And he, in the end, right, when he comes back around to it, can't square that with, it being written by elves. Who should know better? Anyway. Yes, Maureen, I agree. Savage Hobbit sounds like a contradiction in terms, and that's exactly why. Notice he used that word savage in that same exact sense way back when he was talking about the humans. There they are. They were now masterless, and it's the orcs. Yeah. Now, okay, sorry. I thought he used, maybe he did? Said that they were savage? Maybe I'm misremembering. That's of the orcs. In which he means savage in the pejorative sense there, clearly. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. That's what I was remembering. I thought I was remembering that he used it of the humans in the same... Maybe it's in a note. I feel like he did use it. Maybe in a passage I didn't quote. But not in quotation marks. Because it wasn't about hobbits. And I think Marini puts it in quotation marks because it looks so weird there. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So discussion of the history of hobbits, but no origin question. With men of normal stature, they recognized their close kinship, whereas dwarves or elves, whether friendly or hostile, were aliens, with whom their relations were uneasy and clouded by fear. Bilbo's statement, Lord of the Rings 1:162, that the cohabitation of big folk and little folk in one settlement at Bree was peculiar and nowhere else to be found, was probably true in his time, the end of the Third Age. But it would seem that actually hobbits had liked to live with or near to big folk of friendly kind, who with their greater strength protected them from many dangers and enemies and other hostile men, and received in exchange many services. For it is remarkable that the western hobbits preserved no trace or memory of any language of their own. The language they spoke when they entered Eriador was evidently adopted from the men of the Vales of Anduin, related to the Atani, in particular to those of the House of Beor, changed to of the houses of Hador and of Beor, and after their adoption of the common speech, they retained many words of that origin. This indicates a close association with big folk, though the rapid adoption of the common speech in Eriador shows hobbits to have been specially adaptable in this respect, as does also the divergence of the Stoors who had associated with men of different sort before they came to the Shire. All right. First of all, did you catch that really cool thing that Tolkien just does in passing there? Bilbo's statement that the cohabitation of big folk and little folk in one settlement at Bree was peculiar and nowhere else to be found. You see the coolness there? The coolness, because that's written by the narrator. You may remember it's part of the narrator. It's the beginning of the Sign of the Prancing Pony chapter, when the narrator is describing the history of Bree and makes that comment. Nowhere else was this peculiar but excellent arrangement to be found. And here is Tolkien attributing that narrator statement to Bilbo. Just casually. He just calls it Bilbo's statement. Now he gives the citation so that you'll get it if you look it up, right? And it does fit. It does fit. It fits in a couple different... the touch on this is so delicate. I just love it. It is probable that Bilbo did not write that much of the rest of Book One, I think. But there are places where you can tell that Bilbo took a hand. Where are those places? Where are the places? What is it that Tolkien is attributing to Bilbo here? It's so brilliant. He's attributing to Bilbo the voice of the narrator, when the voice of the narrator still sounds a little bit like the narrator of The Hobbit. The intrusive, storytelling, adult-to-child narrator of The Hobbit was the technique he was still openly using. He was still writing explicitly in that mode when he first wrote Chapter 1. And Chapter 1 retains many of those same elements, of course, as many readers have observed. And there are moments, and although he leaves it behind, he doesn't leave it totally behind for quite some time. And it still peeks out every now and again. That narrator's voice peeks out when we get to Bree. That narrator's voice peeks out much more strongly with the thinking fox, right? So what he's done here, casually, without any bells and whistles, created this matrix in which Bilbo, any reference, any intrusion by the narrator, which sounds funny like that, which sounds kind of intrusive and is kind of, again, it's in that mode that the Hobbit narrator is in, is Bilbo. That's Bilbo. And it's not consistent. Even in Book One, it's not consistent all the way through, because Bilbo didn't write it all. Frodo wrote most of it. Bilbo wrote some. He worked on it a little bit, didn't write the whole thing. He and Frodo had a chance to talk over the Book One material while Frodo was in Rivendell. And Bilbo kind of got started, but he didn't write all of it, didn't write that much. Frodo clearly kept some of Bilbo's touches. But yeah. It is such an elegant piece of retcon that he does right there is just fabulous. Notice now he is looking at the history of the hobbits in the same way, well, in a similar way to how he was looking at the history of the Edain a couple slides ago. He had the hobbits all speaking English, right, from the beginning of his writing. As he got further and further in, that fact needed to be retconned more and more detail, right? And now this is a, well, it's hard to say last step. This is a next step, right, that Tolkien is taking to explaining that. Why is there no remnant to Hobbit language? Remember the discussion of this? Remember that moment in the Proto Appendix F where our modern scholar narrator says hobbits believe that they had their own language, but they were wrong, right? Remember where he corrects them, says that their own philological beliefs about their own history are incorrect. Anyway, here he is having another go at that situation, answering the question, why do hobbits just speak common speech all the time? Why is there no evidence of any other language that they have? The only linguistic big deal that gets made is the link between their language and the Rohirrim, the language of the Rohirrim, right? That's the philological point about Hobbit language that gets made. Not about their own language that predated the common speech. There's no hint of that anywhere. And now he takes that fact and he writes the storial history that fact suggests. So once again, telling the history of the hobbits and rooting it in language retroactively now. Given the fact that the hobbits adopted were the most linguistically adaptive of the races in of the peoples in Eriador, we can conclude these things, right? Yeah. David Michael, I agree. He had the hobbits being English from the start, right? They did more than speak English. They kind of were English. Yeah, I agree. Okay, now back to middlemen. And thinking about those parallels between the three houses of the Edain and the three houses of the Eldar. The term middlemen, however, was of ancient origin. That is Faramir's term. It was devised in the Second Age by the Númenóreans when they began to establish havens and settlements on the western shores of Middle-earth. It arose among the settlers in the north between Pelargir and the Gulf of Lune in the time of Ar-Adunahor, for the settlers in this region had refused to join in the rebellion against the Valar, and were strengthened by many exiles of the faithful, who fled from persecution by him and the later kings of Númenor. It was therefore modelled on the classification of the Etani of the by the Etani of the elves. The High Elves, or Elves of Light, were the Noldor who returned in exile out of the far west. The Middle Elves were the Sindar, who, though near kin of the High Elves, had remained in Middle-earth and never seen the light of Aman. And the Dark Elves were those who had never journeyed to the western shores and did not desire to see Aman. This was not the same as the classifications made by the elves, which are not here concerned, except to note that the Dark Elves or Elves of Darkness was used by them, but in no way implied any evil or subordination to Morgoth. It referred only to ignorance of the light of Aman and included the Sindar. Those who had never made the journey to the western shores were called the Refusers of Ari. It is doubtful if any of the Avari ever reached Beleriand or were actually known to the Númenóreans. Okay. So, notice what he's done here. He has taken Faramir's speech, in which Faramir divides men into high men, middle men, and men of darkness. And he has figured, he has then worked backwards, applying those same categories, those same exact terms to the elves, in order to explain where Faramir gets it from. Faramir got it from Númenórean tradition. The Númenóreans got it from the elves, who divided the elves similarly. using those same terms. But again, in like real world chronology, this starts with Faramir, and now he's gone back and he's retrofitted it to the elves. Really interestingly, in fact. Because note how elegantly this works. The Noldor are the high elves, like the Númenóreans are the high men. And what do they have in common? Exiles. Return to Middle-earth. Exiles who have done evil and who are burdened by the shame of their apostasy, who return to Middle-earth. Right? I mean, like, as soon as he makes this parallel, it's like, whoa, okay, sure. Yeah, no, I buy that. I buy that. Yeah, we're getting a peek at Faramir's history book here, while also, Jackie, getting a peek at how Faramir's later statement of history impacts Tolkien's thinking about other things. Because that's the starting point. Faramir's the starting point, right? But hang on, so more on middlemen, but wait a second. First, a note on the sea longing of the Sylvan Elves, because, you know, we're wandering, we're digressing. This, according to the traditions of Dol Amroth, had been established by seafaring. That is, he's talking about. Sorry, this this in question in this case on the footnote. This is a footnote to the reference to the elf haven that is down at the down by near Dol Amroth, like that's down in the south of Gondor. Like, where did that come from? Why is that there? He has to explain that. Here's his explanation. This, according to the traditions of Dol Amroth, had been established by seafaring Sindar from the west havens of Beleriand, who fled in 3 small ships when the power of Morgoth overwhelmed the Eldar and the Etani. But it was later increased by adventurers of the Sylvan Elves seeking for the sea, who came down the Anduin. The Sylvan Elves were Middle Elves according to the Númenórean classification, though unknown to the Etani until later days, for they were like the Sindar Teleri, but were laggards in the hindmost companies who had never crossed the Misty Mountains and established small realms on either side of the Vales of Anduin. Of these, Lorien and the realm of Thranduil and Mirkwood were survivors in the Third Age, but they were never wholly free of an unquiet and a yearning for the sea, which at times drove some of them to wander from their homes. This is Ethelond. Yes, Eric, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Now, where does this come from? What is the seed in the published texts of this? I think mostly Legolas. Legolas points to the idea, and hang on, some of you are thinking, but wait, Legolas isn't a Sylvan elf, he's a Sindar elf. Is he? In the Lord of the Rings? Are we sure of that? He says, we of the Sylvan folk, right? Yeah. He's in the Lord of the Rings. He's like retconned to be Sindar later on. But that's a later construction. He's a strange elf. Exactly, Jackie. That's at the end of the day, Legolas is a strange elf. But the point is, in Legolas and his bout of sea longing that we see in Galadriel's prophecy and all that sort of thing in the Lord of the Rings, we get. It is the one example we get of this thing, of like what seems to be an almost universal sea longing by the elves. That the high elves, like Galadriel, long to return of it. Galadriel wishing she could get back to Valinor, and, you know, her lament for the fact that she can't in her farewell address in Quenya in English is understandable, because that's home. She was born there, right? And even others of the Noldor who were born in Middle-earth, like Elrond, still, like, it's their ancestral home. So, of course, the High Elves are going to have a sea longing, and they're going to be shipping out, because they came from there, they got an invitation to go back, they were like, we'll hang for a bit, and then we'll come, so that's all natural. But what about the other ones? What about the elves who never left? What about the Dark Elves, these Middle Elves? the elves who never saw the light of Valinor at all, do they have sea longing the same way? And Legolas suggests absolutely they do. So the Lord of the Rings contains, like, Tolkien and we discover during the course of the Lord of the Rings that apparently they do, right? And so he here talks about that, right? And explains how it makes sense that they would. Because they did set off on the journey. All of the Middle Elves are ones who would set off originally, who said yes to the journey to Valinor. So it's somewhere in their hearts and the hearts of their people that desire to see the light in the West. Even though the light in the West kind of isn't there anymore, but whatever. Anyway, but you know what I mean. So that longing for the sea. They never made it to the sea. The Sylvan elves didn't make it anywhere close to the sea. At least not the western shores of Beleriand. But they still have it. And therefore, that's why there is an elf haven in the south of Gondor. Because, of course there is. Because there are still Middle Elves with the sea longing who live on that side of the Misty Mountains, who never did cross the Misty Mountains and probably never will cross the Misty Mountains, but they still want to get to the sea. And so they're going to follow the River Anduin like the River Sirion and depart from the sea down by the shore. Okay, back to middlemen. Thus it came about that the Númenórean term middlemen was confused in its application. Its chief test was friendliness towards the west, to elves and to Númenóreans, but it was actually applied usually only to men whose stature and looks were similar to those of the Númenóreans, although this most important distinction of friendliness was not historically confined to peoples of one racial kind. It was a mark of all kinds of men who were descendants of those who had abjured the shadow of Morgoth and his servants and wandered westward to escape it, and certainly included both the races of small stature, Droogs, and Hobbits. So notice what he's saying there? He's saying that it was usually applied to only people whose statures and looks were similar to those of the Númenóreans, aka not hobbits and presumably not dark-skinned people. But then he goes on to say, but the friendliness to the Númenóreans and to elves is the most important feature. And even people who didn't look much like them, they would accept as middlemen, so long as they showed friendliness to elves and Númenóreans. And this is how hobbits make it in. So yep, hobbits are middlemen. Hooray! Congratulations, hobbits and Droogs. Also, it must be said that unfriendliness to Númenóreans and their allies was not always due to the shadow, but in later days to the actions of the Númenóreans themselves. Thus, many of the forest dwellers of the shorelands south of the arid Luin, especially in Minhiriath, were, as later historians recognized, the kin of the folk of Haleth, but they became bitter enemies of the Númenóreans because of their ruthless treatment and their devastation of the forests, and this hatred remained unappeased in their descendants, causing them to join with any enemies of Númenor. In the Third Age, their survivors were the people known in Rohan as the Dunlendings. Boom. So the cultural history of the Dunlendings gets even more complicated. The Dunlendings are descendants of the Halathites, yeah. First, and secondly, of course they're going to be opposed to the Rohirrim and to the Gondorians because they bear resentment against the Númenóreans for good reason. Ancestrally. Yes, they have a long history of displacement. Notice his word, bitter. Bitter enemies. I think not just in a purely amplifying sense of like how, strongly were they enemies. But I think that's a quality there too. They are bitter. The Dunlendings are a bitter people. Displaced once and displaced again. Yeah. 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 lots of, yeah, I agree, Eric, that lots of interesting stuff to think about with this as background to the stories of Rohan and Kalanarthan and to the film The War of the Rohirrim. Absolutely. And yes, A.D. Pirtle, I was unsurprised but quite disappointed that the film like completely dodged that question entirely. I thought it was understandable, but ever so slightly cowardly. I was kind of hoping they would face it a little bit instead of just kind of leaving the elephant in the room. Instead, they imported new elephants, which seemed an odd choice, but whatever. Yeah. Anyhow, okay. I know we're late now, and I started early, but we're so close. It's okay. I'll stop because there's no point in pushing. I think I've only got like a couple, 2 or 3 slides left. So next time we will tidy up my very last fun observations on this first essay, and we will go to the second rambling essay that Christopher provides to us, which is the Shibboleth of Feanor. So prepare, because it's about to get nerdy, right? I mean, like, this was a little bit nerdy, but you know, that's the Shibboleth of Feanor is going to be seriously nerdy, right? So tune in next time for some serious nerdiness from Tolkien in his rambling about sound changes among the elves and its political and historical ramifications. I know, Copperfinch, I'm not saying that it hasn't been nerdy to this point, but it's going to get nerdier. It's totally going to get nerdier. All right. Finishing this up and then Shibboleth of Feanor next time. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.